So, for most of my life, I have worn a mask. And I'm not talking about the mask that we're wearing because of the pandemic, because of COVID. I'm talking about a mask I've worn that made it appear to the world and everybody outside of myself that I was okay. I'm talking about the mask that I wore to cover up my pain, my fear, my grief, my disappointments, my anxiety. No one ever knew that I was suffering because I always showed up with a smile on my face, but I suffered on the inside. And that mask that I wore, it served a purpose at one point because I grew up in the hood. I grew up in Oakland, and where I grew up, you couldn't show emotions and be safe. Showing any kind of emotions in the hood was a sign of weakness. So you put on a mask. Even if you were afraid, you didn't show up afraid. You showed up like you had confidence and were courageous. And on the inside, you could be shaking in your boots, but on the outside, you look like you were good. And so I adapted that as my norm. So I learned to not show emotions. I learned to not show fear when all along, in many instances, I was afraid and I was scared and I was hurt and I was disappointed, but I didn't let anyone know. And oftentimes, when we wear the mask and we don't talk about it to anyone, anyone that we trust, because you can't share all your stuff with everybody. You know that, right? So, but not sharing it with folks that you know love you and support you and have your best interests at heart is a disservice to you, and it's a disservice to them, because oftentimes when we're going through things alone and when we're suffering in silence, the most minor issue can feel overwhelming when you're keeping it in. And so for most of my life, that's what I did. Nobody knew what I was going through. And the way wearing a mask manifested in my life was when I was in college, in my early 20s, I started having panic attacks. Nobody knew because, again, I wore the mask and I acted as if I was okay. Even when I went through the most difficult time of my life after my mom passed, I didn't really show emotions. I really didn't even grieve. I just kind of tried to get back to normal. And for 10 years, I was depressed and didn't even know it. It showed up in my life because I wasn't really productive. I really wasn't making anything happen. I was just kind of going through the motions of life. And it wasn't until I was diagnosed with cancer when I realized how detrimental wearing a mask really is. Now, I know sometimes the mask is a survival mechanism, but when it becomes your norm, when you don't know how to take off the mask, when you are always on, when you always have the mask on, it really can become very detrimental to your health and your well-being. And not just your mental health, your physical health. When you are suffering in silence, it weighs on your body. It creates stress in your body. It releases cortisol. That's the stress hormone in your body. Because although you are showing this face of confidence and fake joy to the world, you can't trick your body. Your body knows what you're thinking. Your body knows what you're feeling. And for me, wearing a mask showed up as cancer in 2015. Because when you hold stuff in, it's going to come out some way. And mine manifested as cancer. And that for me really was a turning point, because what I discovered when I began to talk about my cancer, because when I was going through cancer, I took off the mask and I'm like, look, this is what's going on. This is what is happening. I found that I wasn't alone. I found that as I began to talk about my feelings and what I had gone through, and how I knew I had been unhappy for a long, long time. I knew I had been just kind of going through the motions and just living with just a lot of fear. And I experienced a lot of loss. I was, at the time, I had 2 homes in Atlanta, and I started struggling financially, and nobody knew. And I was losing things, and I was embarrassed, but nobody knew because I still wore the mask and I still made it appear as though I was okay. But when the cancer thing happened, none of that mattered. And I was able to finally get real with myself first. And then I was able to talk to those who I love and I know love me about what was really going on in my life. And I think it's just so important. And I know sometimes we have to put on the mask for survival's sake. But it's important that we learn to realize at some point you don't need that mask, because you are good just the way you are. Just the way you are. You're not perfect, none of us are, but you're good just the way you are, and you are entitled to have whatever emotions you have, whether it's fear, whether it's doubt. Those are all okay. Those are all human emotions. It's okay to feel that way. But when you bottle it up, at some point, it is going to burst. At some point, it's going to explode, whether it is in a physical, medical condition or an emotional, mental issue. And so, just want you to consider that, to realize you don't need that mask anymore. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to act like you're okay when you're not okay. And that it's okay to get support. It's okay to get some help to get you through whatever you're going through. And here's what I know, is that when you take off that mask and you see who you really are, you realize that you're enough. You're enough. So let's take off